The flames sawed in the wind, and the embers paled and deepened, and paled and deepened, like the blood beat of some living thing eviscerate upon the ground before them, and they watch the fire which does contain within it something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it, and are divided from their origins, and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, the first fire and the last ever to be. By and by the judge rose and moved away on some obscure mission, and after a while someone asked the ex-priest if it were true that at one time there had been two moons in the sky, and the ex-priest eyed the false moon above them and said that it may well have been so. But certainly the wise high God in his dismay at the proliferation of lunacy on this earth must have wetted a thumb and leaned down out of the abyss and pinched it hissing into extinction. And could he find some alter means by which the birds could mend their paths in the darkness, he might have done with this one too.
Hi, Candy.
Hi, JVH, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good. Good to be doing this again.
Good to be doing this again.
Yes, we're in chapter 17.
Chapter 17, yeah.
I know.
Second half, almost at the end.
Second half, we've been doing this for a while, quite a while now, and it just takes the time it takes. Thank you to everybody who might be tuning in right now and listening. We really appreciate you.
We
And
definitely do.
we definitely do. And we also, in case you're new and you haven't heard, I mean, I'm filling up social media with this, but we definitely have, we're going to remind listeners if you happen to come across this podcast, we have co-created a deck of tarot cards inspired by the novel Blood Meridian.
It is an absolutely amazing deck, and I feel like co-created is a little bit strong because it was you and Stag who were the primary creative forces, and I was just like your, consultant or whatever. But I am so absolutely thrilled with the deck. It's just an incredible work of art in itself, an incredibly creative response to Blood Meridian. It shows like how deeply, we've all, like you and I and Stag, have been thinking about this novel and like turning it into concepts and images and just like trying to convey to our dear listeners how life-changing this work has been for both of us, or for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, to be fair, we did put every card past you. You gave us ideas and images. You gave us pathways and goals, and you brought the Baroque into the deck of cards. So, I mean, you did have a lot to do with it. Yes, we did do the footwork, if you will, but you
Yeah,
were our puppeteer.
yeah. Yeah, they're amazing, like takes. I don't know what the right word would be on like Samuel Chamberlain's art from the original manuscript of My Confession. There's a so like Blood Meridian itself, the deck is just full of quotations and citations and styles and everything that, has come up in our encounter with this novel.
Definitely, and there's anachronisms, there's time travel. They sometimes they look like a graphic novel, sometimes they look like fan art, sometimes they look like their own version of art. And yeah, I think they're a lot of fun. Even if you didn't read the novel, I think you would enjoy them because tarot cards are going to love them. We've already had feedback that we've had a few tarot collectors and they're just crazy about them. And they're asking questions and wondering, tell me about this card or that card. They are in the US, they are $100 including shipping and handling. In Canada, they are 125 including shipping and handling. And why don't you email us, right?
Yeah,
JVH?
yes, at bloodmeridiannow@gmail.com.
Yeah.
And we can figure out the payment and the shipping issues.
Yeah, we're using e-transfer in Canada and Venmo in the United States. I mean, I could also do a PayPal too, but I'm sure we can work it out. But yeah, email us and then we'll get your mailing address and send them out. They are a limited edition, original, no AI, no GMO.
Yep.
Yeah. All
Awesome.
right. So, the first thing I noticed was when I opened up to chapter 17 that I don't have very many pages left to read. If there's only about 100 pages and they look even less looking at the book. And I felt a little sorrow like, gee, we're almost done. Having said that, the book seems to know it's almost done. The novel itself seems to be winding down. Um, there's,
Yes,
yeah,
100%.
the drive of the gang has changed. They don't seem concerned with a work day. They also one thing I noticed was that they run into another gang at the beginning, Colonel Garcia's men, who the gang that we know, they're already a mess. They're just there's very few of them left. Glanton sits by the fire and he realizes what men were left. And then this other gang comes by and they don't even have shirts. Some of them don't have pants. Some of them are naked. They're hunting indigenous people, but they might have a rope or a bad gun or something. I mean, they're not even remotely equipped. So the winding down of this whole governmental effort to take over the West is also winding down, just like the novel is.
Yeah, 100%. Like you mentioned, the encounter with the Sonoran militia
Thank
or
you.
whatever. So
Mm.
it's like they're Mexican and they're out hunting Apache or something like that.
Hmm.
And Glanton has this you know, he basically looks at them and there's this passage. Yeah, we do get a lot of like Glanton's interiority in this chapter,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
makes which is something we should be discussing as well. But like in this encounter with the Mexicans, we read that Glanton pushed on through, like without really saying anything. They were of another nation, those riders, and all that land to the south out of which they'd originated, and whatever lands to the east toward which they were bound were dead to him,
Mm.
and both the ground and any sojourners upon it remote and arguable of substance. So this is also like, the Glanton gang has basically like left Mexico for good.
Mm.
Uh, and they've left scalp hunting also. Like this isn't really spelled out explicitly in the novel, but like, the scalp hunting days are over for Glanton and his gang, and
Mm.
therefore for the kid and the judge.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's definitely, there, in Chamberlain, I think it's more apparent that Glanton like expresses a desire to go to the gold fields, like that's kind of what is about to happen. They're about to kind of have their last sort of station, in Fort Yuma and like and this ferry situation that basically brings the Glanton gang to its end.
Mm.
But yeah, like sense of an ending in this chapter, very strong.
Definitely. And I thought there was a little bit of a tell, I watch a lot of not a lot, but a fair bit of reality shows competition like Survivor or Top Chef. And you can start to understand that the editing kind of gives you a clue who's going to get voted off because sometimes they give you a little more attention to that one person that you're not going to see ever again, that their camera time is almost up. But I have a weird thing, and I was telling you earlier, it was probably about the 12th time. It was around that time period that I read the novel again, and it's years ago. I got to the part where Glanton dies and I cried. I was like, what the hell? I hate this guy. Why am I crying? But this time reading around, I was like, you're not going to feel this empathy for the guy. But there is that page where he has the aspen and they're riding through an aspen forest and the leaves are golden and falling and Glanton the narrator tells us that Glanton sees its perfection and I that kind of gave me a shivers. That tells us that he has a visual appreciation. He certainly loves horses and dogs, right? But he loves nature and he can see the beauty in nature. And then he has the part later on where he looks back and he knows he's not going to see his wife and newborn baby ever again. And it's kind of like, wow, I mean, what drove him to be out here doing this? Uh, Possibly no work or this idea of the American dream and maybe he thought he would go and do this and go back home. Maybe there was an idea, or maybe he thought he would send money home or something. I don't know. Was there a Pony Express back then? I don't know. I don't think there was Western Union yet, or was there? And then this opens up with quite, like you said, a very interiority of Glanton. I went, oh, this is so rare in a lot of the novel to feel this bonding. So I think why I feel it. And when we get to the part where Glanton goes, I always felt like, in Cleopatra and Antony, when Antony dies, it's his friend that he falls on the sword of somebody he respects. And I always thought, oh, Glanton dies on the by the hands of somebody who's an equal warrior. And that always made sense to me, he died by a peer. And I found that choked me up, even though I can't stand this guy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that it's funny the passage where that we're talking about in chapter 17, where
Hmm.
he's basically sitting at a fire, right? And he's thinking. But we don't get like a stream of consciousness like we might in Joyce, right? We get
Right.
a third person description of his kind of thoughts and feelings from the narrator. So many gone, defected or dead, the Delawares all slain. So,
Yeah.
and he watched the fire, and if he saw portents there, it was much the same to him, and the passage actually kind of um, really goes kind of deep, and we start to hear that, like even though, he acknowledges his destiny, which is,
Hmm.
he who lives by the sword will die by the sword,
Hmm.
is written in stone, he nonetheless claims agency. So it's we have
Yeah.
this wonderful sort of reiteration of the whole fate and free will kind of concern that pervades the novel. So it is like the novel is coming to an ending. It's also repeating its themes, and it's again kind of like analyzing the themes that it has been carrying, or that has been carrying it all the
Hmm.
way through the novel. And the one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, like, is like how kind of especially in you see that Glanton's characterization in this chapter is almost that of like a protagonist in an ancient Greek tragedy.
Mm.
And I was thinking of like the quotation by McCarthy in some kind of interview. I don't know whether it was the Oprah interview or some other ones, where he basically says, if you look at classical literature, the core of literature is the idea of tragedy.
Mm.
He says you don't really learn much from the good things that happen to you. Tragedy is at the core of human experience, and it's what we have to deal with, and that's what makes life difficult, and that's what we want to know about. So McCarthy's sort of like very orthodox Aristotelian adherence to an idea of tragedy is very much sort of like in play in this novel, especially in the character of Glanton in this chapter in particular, insofar as he's trying to reconcile agency and fate, which is sort of what often happens at the end of a classical tragedy.
Hmm.
And I was thinking about the way Aristotle kind of conceptualizes how a tragic plot is put together. And, on the one hand, so he uses in the Poetics these two terms, Decius and Lusus, right? Like he'll say like a good tragic plot should either have a beginning, middle, and an end.
Hmm.
That's one way to describe it. The other way to describe it is, it has a Decius and a Lusus. And so Decius would be like the sort of complication is a kind of typical way of interpreting that term, but it's like literally it refers to like weaving and knotting, and lusus is about unraveling and loosening. So, a good tragic plot complicates and tangles and weaves together a whole bunch of incidents. Then at some point, it starts to unravel these things, and then it unravels them to some kind of conclusion. And, I just by virtue of the symmetry of the novel, and how the symmetry is pointed out over and over again. Like in the title, we have Blood Meridian or the Evening Redness in the West, and the chapters are divided into 23, and we can kind of locate the center of the novel in chapter 12, which is when the Glanton gang slaughters the Gelenos. And so and chapter 12 is broken into two sections, so the novel sort of unfolds in this beautiful symmetrical two-sidedness.
Mm.
um, And you might say that actually the novel has started to end in chapter 12, but it's
Mhm,
becoming more and more self-conscious about its ending
mhm.
as we move on.
Well, and it's interesting too because it's the downswing of this economy. This is, we talk about a bubble in the Silicon Valley bubble. Well, this is the bubble of scalp hunting. Scalp hunting is bursting, and the
Right.
buffalo.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Yes.
it's a
Exactly.
crash that we're seeing,
Yeah.
and it's kind of crazy that that's a little going down where the novel's situated in that. It's the last year of great money in the scalp hunting business.
Yeah, exactly. And I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, the sort of the crashing and the ending and the unraveling and the loosening just become more and more apparent. I mean, Glanton's gang will be done in a couple of chapters, right?
Hmm.
But at the beginning of this chapter, he's sitting contemplating the end of his life in a fire. But by the end of chapter 19, his dead corpse is in the fire, like
Hmm.
so he's coming to a quick end, and like just the imagery of endings, and with the buffalo extinctions at the end, or the dead bear, the dead dancing bear and stuff like that.
Right.
Um,
Right.
Yeah, so
Very cool.
you could look at this division between Decius and Lucis as, like symmetrically and linearly.
Hmm.
At some point, the plot complicates to a certain extreme, and then at that point, things start unraveling. So you can, so like if you buy the argument that this is a symmetrical book divided into two
Hmm.
halves around the point of chapter 12, then you can take Decius and Lucis sort of literally and put them in a linear order. And so now we're in the unraveling part of the novel.
Mm.
But like, there's a book on Aristotle's Poetics that I really like by a classicist named Michael Davis, and he also says that yeah, Decius and Lucis, you can think about it in terms of a linear ordering of events, but you can also think about it as sort of like Lucis is happening at the same time as Decius, so Decius could translate into simply plotting, right? Like, and so of course, like this book, the plot is changing, but it's still here, right? Like they've come to, Fort Yuma and the river and the ferry crossing. And so it's just another point in the plot. But, so Davis also says that the Lucis is kind of happening from the very beginning as well. And
Mm.
Lucis, um, that word is at in the core of the English word analysis, right? So it's like the novel is, Davis describes tragedy as not just a simple plot, but a kind of a plot that is split, so tragedy splits into a section that presents a story and a section that reveals the meaning of the first section. But the second section is also part of a story, and so not simply detached analysis.
Mm.
So I mean, all of this to say is that Blood Meridian is kind of like it's an allegorical, double-voiced kind of narrative that is analyzing the plot that it's also unfolding at every stage, right? So,
Mm.
um, anyways, yeah. So,
Well, that's very cool. Very cool. Yeah, tragedy's a funny thing. It's not funny thing, but I was trying to think of things in my life. Is there something good that happened that I would call a learning curve? I'm sure there is, but you're right that the hardships are where we go, oh, I don't want to do this again, or you learn a lesson or something.
well, I think
Uh,
it's cool that he says, I don't know, and I don't know if I agree, like with the core of literature is the idea of tragedy. I maybe, you know, maybe I'd even say the opposite, like
mm,
literature is inherently comic because it's sort of play, and play is like affirmative and free and all of that sort of stuff.
hmm.
But when he says you don't learn much from the good things that happen to you, so as a storyteller, you need to go to the bad things.
Hmm.
He's basically saying that storytelling is a form of learning, or reading is a form of learning.
Hmm.
So the novel should be it should have some kind of instruction, or I don't know if instruction is the right word. It's not like didactic, like this is how you
Hmm.
should live your life, but it should teach you about something, and
Yeah,
that's also very Aristotelian, right? Like
I was
because
going to say classic. Yeah, classical, or yeah, you're right. That is Aristotle, because I was going to say that, at some point around the time of Blood Meridian, novels did change a bit. The idea, the author is dead was probably what, like 1980? When did that phrase come out,
Yeah.
and the idea of an argument that many novels, I used to look for novels in the like classics. I love classics and look in the first few page for what's the argument of this novel and find it, and people don't necessarily write that way anymore or even understand that that was a thing. And our friend Rick Wallach always said, who cares? We get to make it however we want to, and that is true. Same for looking at any kind of culture or art. We can interpret it the way we want to. But
And that's learning, right?
yes,
You
yes.
know, like so Aristotle will say like poetry springs from two sources. One of them is just our love of being rhythmically entrained.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we hear music, like we dance, right? Like
Yeah.
because we love feeling entrained by rhythm. But the other reason that poetry exists is because of mimesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he'll say right at the beginning of Poetics that, we are the most imitative animals. Like, all animals are imitative or mimetic, and maybe you could even say that all beings, whether organic or organisms or not, have a mimetic component to them. But the humans are the most imitative, and we imitate because we love to learn. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So when McCarthy says, when he links literature and learning together, tragic things make life difficult, and we want to know about that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and he's basically like really just kind of reiterating classical orthodoxy on what literature is and what it's about, and why we read it in the first place, because literature is a mimesis of things, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a mimesis of things that happened in the 19th century, maybe, like,
Mm-hmm.
put it super simply.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to learn about that, you
Yeah,
know.
well, I agree. I agree with McCarthy, and I think that art is about that. Either involving predictable outcomes and then imposing unpredictable outcomes, which I'm doing a presentation on the virtual conference in Albuquerque. It's an online June one, but my topic has to do with the science on surprise. And there's evidence that, and I always think of McCarthy because he has exotic, bizarre, spectacle, right? And there's a correlation with novelty and learning. So, he does a very good job at that. I think that's part of why the novel brings us back because we can't really grasp some of the fantastical things that happen in Blood Meridian, and it does surprise us. I feel I feel a sense of surprise or novelty every time I read it.
I know, with every sentence is like a
Yeah.
sense of surprise.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Hey, the part we read, I'm going to jump around because I know we're going to talk about a lot of topics, but I did want to. There was a couple of things that I thought were like anachronisms in here, and one of them was, and considering that McCarthy is kind of well known for being into science, he's a bit of a geek, was that Davy Brown, in that quote that we had at the beginning of this episode, he talks about um, could he find some other means by which the birds could mend their paths in the darkness? He might have done with this moon too. So Davy Brown is saying that the birds use the moon to navigate. And that is in 1850, that would be an unusual concept scientifically. It could in fact be a folkways way of looking at how animals um, navigate because it's unusual because science is still arguing about animal navigation. I remember Stephen Jay Gould had a great essay about a fellow who argued that turtles were using the stars. You know how we
Right.
see those videos of the turtles swimming to the island and they always go to the same place, same beach and lay their eggs. How do they know? So and this argument was they're following the stars just like we would. And then there's an argument of course, magnetic navigation, some kind of force field that the animals are feeling the pull of something. And they're still hashing it out. I mean, really, since 2010, there's much more arguments on it, but they're still not conclusive at all. So I just found that kind of interesting that he thought
That's
that.
so cool. Yeah.
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 It seemed like it shouldn't be in there. And there's another anachronism coming up when we get further into the chapter. You know, um,
What's that?
well, I would say it's the dinosaur bone, and that the judge says that the dinosaurs are extinct, and it's an animal that went extinct. Now, certainly there are lots of animals that went extinct. The only thing is that by 1985, certainly the theory of that they are birds was around. Maybe it wasn't as mainstream as Jurassic Park, which came about 6 years after this novel, right? The first Jurassic Park. And kind of really the raptor animal in that really hinted at a bird. The bird feature was, and at some point they just assumed these animals had scaly skin or something. They didn't even realize that they have feathers. Now
Right.
I watched the dinosaur documentary. I think it's about 3 episodes, and at first I wasn't going to watch it because I didn't think it'd be that innovative. It was really good, and the feathers on the birds and the details of a feather-like material was really good. But I just thought that was funny because I would have thought that McCarthy would have known that. However, it is the judge saying it. So, it again, that makes it kind of fun reading that,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
you know. And the judge is wrong.
No wonder he doesn't like birds.
There you go. It's funny because my mom was terrified of birds. Petrified. Have I said that before on here?
I don't know. I
No,
also know
okay.
somebody who's terrified of birds. My
Yeah,
parents' neighbors.
yeah, it was very normal to me. I didn't realize my mom was unusual until I got older in school and stuff. But when my sister and I, when we would go to a park, we had to run into the park and scare the birds away first. I completely thought that was normal. I felt, my mom's afraid of birds. I didn't feel it. My sister and I didn't pick it up from her or anything. You'd think kids would copy that. Not at all, but she was
Huh.
petrified. Yeah,
So it's like
and
an archaic mammalian response to the reptile or something.
yeah, so when I did get older, I was like, Mom,
Maybe as dinosaur.
that's what I told her. I said, You're actually probably the most well adjusted about your fear of birds. It's completely rooted in science. They're terrified. One time at the Vancouver Zoo, there was my nephew, and I don't know if Stag was there, probably not, but we were going to the aquarium, and then I realized there was penguins, and I turned around and I yelled, Mom, there's penguins, are you
Oh.
okay? And she was like, No, they don't, they're fine, they don't have the beady eyes and little claw feet. And I mean, all the tourists were looking at us like we were so insane, like who's afraid of penguins? But she did not classify a penguin as a bird
Huh.
for whatever reason. I guess because they do look a little warmer and fuzzier.
And they kind of stand on 2 feet. Well,
Oh,
I
they
guess
stand
all
on.
birds
Oh,
sort
yeah,
of do.
that's interesting. But they
Penguins,
they
uh,
don't they don't fly. Maybe that helps too. I don't know. I don't know
they,
what it was. And if those are feathers, they're very tight. I mean, she just can't stand anything but a bird.
huh.
God rest her soul. She's at peace now. I mean, she got hypnotized for it and everything. And my mother lived on a boat on the West Coast. So go figure, my family was insane, where there's like thousands of seagulls flying around. And blood-curdling screams if they did come towards her. So, I didn't have any embarrassment about that, right? It just seemed really normal. Just concern. All
There
right.
weren't
I,
any
I
birds
I took us
that
way
you would
off
like.
topic. I'm so sorry.
Uh, funny.
Ugh. We can cut that out, actually. Maybe we will. My mother. Um, yeah.
Well, like I love I have to mention like the prank at the beginning of the novel
Oh,
when
please.
gang, they I guess they owe Mangus Coloradus like some kind of reparation for Glanton's horse biting his horse.
Hmm.
Right? So
Mhm.
they agreed to bring them a barrel of whiskey. So they pull a pretty good prank, right? Like where, they drink most of the whiskey, put like the remaining part in, and then, rig the barrel so that it contains mostly water. So it's like sloshing around, so it feels like it's all liquid. And
Mhm.
when you first drain it, it will be whiskey. So like,
Mhm. Mhm.
so a great prank, but also like the fact that this barrel is drained,
Yeah.
of most of its good stuff is also sort of like feeding into the sort of sense of ending.
Oh, so
Uh,
true. And
and yeah,
and
the,
the future of American economy. Right? The scam. Get the snake oil, sell the pitch. Here's
Right.
a look at our packaging. You get
Yeah.
this big of a you get a package that's like 12 inches by 8 inches for a little tiny computer part, and then all the packing around it. So I think they did it. They must have had a platform in there above the whiskey. I'm assuming they put a board in there or something.
Yeah, I don't know how
I
they
don't
rigged that.
either. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Because
mean,
you'd want,
it's like part of a series of pranks, right? Like
yeah,
starting with the judge's pranking of Reverend Green,
totally.
and these are very mean-spirited, like, you
Yes.
know, pranks that are designed to insult. And insult, like, means, like it's violence, right? The person who's, or people who are being pranked. And the Glanton gang have kind of no respect. I mean, they're racist, so
Yeah.
they can just prank with impunity, like different indigenous people that they encounter. So they probably get away with this one, or they do get away with this one because they, deliver the barrel probably in the evening, and then they ride off at night, and the Apache won't follow them because they don't ride at night. Blah blah blah. And then,
Hmm.
of course, by the end of the chapter, they're going to encounter Caballo on Pelo and like the Yumas and they have no respect for them either. Like Glanton doesn't, right? Glanton in particular, says, "Aren't you like a bunch of crazy looking people?" So,
Yeah.
and of course they're going to prank the Yumas, right? They're
Yeah.
going to pretend to, conspire with them to take over the ferry, and then when the Yumas attack, they take the howitzer and they blow them apart, and so they betray them. So there's another kind of prank.
True.
And so that it's you know it, that's another kind of like ongoing thing that happens in the novel.
Yeah, that's a great point. It also is a military thing. Plane pranks could be part of the military because
Sure,
Bill
yeah, I guess.
Blass, the clothing designer, he was part of World War II where they made a fake company. They made tanks out of balloons, like they had inflatable tanks, put them in the woods, and it was all done so that
Oh,
the
cool, yeah,
Germans would be
that is so cool.
disguised. And then if you think of hunting, we have decoys and blinds. And actually, one of our tarot cards, the Fool, we put Hermes the Thief. Um,
Yes,
I
I
was
love it.
inspired by Norman O'Brown's book, Hermes the Thief. Talk about classical literature. There's a
Oh,
classical
and
analysis.
look at the Trojan horse, I guess, is what
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
the Franken epic, anyways.
Yeah, so we do look at that as a sign of intelligence. Look at, and we admire Dillinger was great because he robbed banks who were hurting the people, and he was looked at as a hero. However, these guys take it to a new height where they're doing pranks, but they're they're not good.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're kind of jumping around, but this is
Yeah,
the end of the novel, like or sorry, the end of the chapter.
yeah.
And like Glanton basically looks at um, the Yumas and thinks that he can do whatever he wants. He's smarter than them, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
made like if he's a tragic hero in this chapter, that's his flaw, right? That's his
Mm-hmm.
hubris right there by misjudging the appearance, the sort of absurd appearance from his perspective of how they look because they're dressed in like different sorts of particles of clothing or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But and the judge is the only one who kind of measures them up, and the judge is the only one who kind of can see that not everything that looks one way is that way, but maybe some other way. So, and of course, like when the Yumas attack,
Mm,
the judge is ready with the howitzer in his tent, right? So yeah, Glanton really is a kind of a tragic figure
yeah, yeah, he kind of is.
in this chapter.
Yeah,
But I also like I wanted to talk about like the importance of fire, like
yeah.
in this chapter. The passage that you read at the beginning, like that passage in the chapter subheadings, is basically signaled as this phrase, the Godfire,
Mm,
right? Which is well, of course, sort of that image of Godfire will reappear, at the in the epilogue, right,
mm-hmm.
with the post hole digger and freeing the sparks or whatever that are
Right.
described in those kind of theological ways.
Yes.
But like I love how Glanton sort of like is staring into the embers of the fire, and the narrator says if he sees any portents, it's all the same to him, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the idea that you could contemplate fire, like if we want to talk about sort of like the scientific, stratum of this chapter, like we're talking about paleontology,
Mm-hmm.
the femur that the judge finds, but fire also like as a tool, you know,
Mm-hmm.
as a tool that has also kind of created the human out of the primate sort of ancestor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I like that when Glanton is looking into the fire, he's sort of like reading the fire for portents,
Mm-hmm.
which is, so the fire is not just a tool, to keep warm or to cook food or whatever, but it's also like a tool for reflection. And that he might look into the fire for portents, the
Mm-hmm.
way an astrologer might look at the stars for portents of what's happening, is basically like, we could call this sort of like the episteme of resemblance and similarity. Like if you're looking for signs of things and other things, you basically like are in a worldview where everything is mimetically responding to everything else. So like fire is a kind of, if the human being is the most mimetic of all animals, well, maybe fire is also kind of one of the most mimetic of, inorganic beings. I guess like maybe we could relate it to like the way we use stars to read, to navigate, to read not only the present but the future and stuff like that. But like just this idea of mimesis, um, in the image of reading fire, for portents is also really interesting, and it did kind of make me remember how in The Crossing, there's the character of Quixada that Billy encounters a few times in the novel. And Quixada is actually based on like a real person named Lupe Quijada that the American folklorist J. Frank Dobie wrote about. So that, McCarthy must have read Dobie, and, because Quijada worked at Randolph Hearst Babacore Ranch uh, where Billy's horses are taken or whatever in the crossing. And but Dobie also describes how Quijada had a habit of staying up at night and contemplating a fire, right? And he quotes Quijada as saying, "The fire is the thinker, a silencer. It makes shadows. It reveals strange things." So I just love, throughout the novel, actually, the way in which, all of the kind of important stories that are mainly the judge tells, although Tobin tells a great story in chapter 10, these are stories that are told around a fire, right? And so um, just the way the fire appears at least twice
Mm-hmm.
this chapter. First, Glanton, as a kind of medium for Glanton's reflections about his life. And then second, in the passage that you wrote, where all of the men are kind of like looking at the flames and how it seemed to be like a living thing and eviscerate upon the ground, and how, they watch the fire, which does contain within it something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it and are divided from their origins and are exiles.
Mm-hmm.
That's just such an important, again, reiteration of a kind of figure that goes throughout the entire novel and is so important.
Yeah, and it kind of relates to things that you were suggesting about the prank, because the fire is another, if you are looking for reverie, you're looking because the fire does give you shapes. It is an illusion. Sometimes people see a figure in there, or they see, right? They're divining, they're getting divination because of the shapes, like looking at clouds. And um that kind of trick in the whiskey, and later we're going to have a little trick with the judge doing a coin.
Right,
And
exactly.
you made a good point, I think, about the whiskey being to do with fraud. And wouldn't that also kind of, what I think I was trying to say was, it was so American, or so not just American, but it is really about that ripoff. You make a product, you put shit in a stick, call it something else, and make a
Suckers
million
for it
dollars.
every minute.
Yeah. So I mean they'd have to get away from those guys with that trick. Um,
That's such a cool connection. It does like connect to the ignis fatuus,
yeah.
right? That it's mentioned that posts men to fraudulent destinies or whatever.
There you go.
So there's fraudulence like all throughout nature.
All throughout nature, again, that's why we don't always hate a trickster. We don't always hate a thief. It depends on the context. It depends on whether they have the moral high ground. And at this point, these guys don't have it. It started out with a legal high ground. They do have the full support legally originally, but we have to sit and watch who they are now and decide, are they right or wrong? You know?
Yeah, and I mean the law of like settler colonialism itself is fraudulent, right? I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
so it's
Exactly.
they're
Exactly.
legitimated through fraud, they commit fraud.
Right. Oh, and I would add, I'm gonna slip in here. I think I'm just being totally ADHD today, but I got you to watch it. We're talking about fire, and I just would want our listeners to look at something. This daydreaming fire, we could say, oh, it's hundreds of years old, it's thousands of years old. It's actually hundreds of thousands of years old. I got JVH to watch on Netflix one chapter, just one episode of this show called Unknown Cave of Bones, and I highly recommend it to anyone because it does have bones, it has fire, it has markings. And I found it very conducive to the things that we like to think about with the novel. It's about the Homo naledi, who were about 200,000 years ago. They would take fire into the bottom of this cave, and I do recommend it. So it isn't, who knows how amazing it would have been. They do recreate the fire in that cave, and it's gorgeous. So I recommend it, and it ties into a mimetic, as JVH would say, mimetic being.
I really like that documentary. Um, the kind of main scientist or the group of scientists, they were so excited, and it was just like um, enjoyable to see like nerds geeking out at
Hmm. Hmm.
these things from like the deepest history imaginable. And obviously, like it's not only prehistoric history, it is really pre-human history.
It's pre-human. They're not human. They are like a distant primate cousin to us. They aren't
Well,
even,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
don't know if I
They're another hominid species,
right, which we're
right?
still fall under the pri under primates, but you're right.
Yes.
We do
Yeah.
try not to think of ourselves as primates, but we are.
Well, there, yeah, the arguments that the scientists are
Oh,
making, I don't know if like how like where the argument stands in like paleontology right now.
okay.
The argument they were making was that the general consensus would have been because of the physical brain size of Homo naledi,
Mm,
they would not have been capable of symbolic thought, right? They
right.
like the documentary is about this particular cave where these scientists have found uh, a burial site, so that Homo naledi were not only had they sort of like discovered the usefulness of fire as a tool, but they also discovered like the ritual of burial, right? Of burying one's dead.
Hmm.
I mean, the word human, I think, and somebody a listener can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think etymologically it's related to the word humus, and which is somehow related to burial. So like what makes us human is we bury our dead. But
Hmm.
now we're finding a hominid species that buried their dead, had, like had the tool of fire, but also had potential markings too. Like so it was the beginning, like also like symbolic culture,
Hmm.
maybe pre-linguistic, but
Hmm.
there are markings in the cave that seem to be like intentional.
Hmm. Hmm.
So all of these things like that Homo sapiens have thought define them as a unique species, we're already in another species.
Right, right. And I
So
and it does make me think, of course, which we may revisit over the following episodes of the Yuma Sun article. Obviously the paleontology of it relates to it, and they found little tiny skulls, and these were tiny, um, They're only like 4 feet 9 inches or something.
Yeah, like the Bodo skulls from that article, those are also a different species. I think it's like Homo afarensis or something
Okay.
like that. So like there's Homo afarensis, Homo naledi. So there was a whole bunch of
Yeah.
different hominid species, and sapiens were the only ones that, well, that are the only ones that haven't gone yet extinct, but that's probably coming fairly soon for.
Yeah, it sure seems like it, doesn't it? It's more than we would have thought even 5 years ago.
But I mean, I just love the way, like, and so I love the way fire is this complicated, like layered figure. I guess I would use the word figure, because of my predilection toward reading Blood Meridian as allegory.
Mm,
If you think
hmm
about like the way the medieval monks used to read the Bible as a, four-leveled polysemic allegory,
mm,
where like the plot and the imagery, which would have been the literal level of the text, supported all of these other meaning levels of the text. So when I look at the figure of fire, I kind of read it in that way, that, fire becomes a figure through which we can contemplate scientifically the origins of the Homo sapiens, and we can contemplate, for example, the evolutionary reasons why we are so fucking violent, right? And of course, like McCarthy will explore those ideas like very explicitly in Whales and Men.
mm,
So it's on the one hand, fire becomes a figure for contemplating science, and learning about science through the novel. But it's also a way to learn about, philosophy and theology. The idea that we are like fire because we are divided from our origins and our exiles.
mm,
I think we can take this scientifically, like something has deterritorialized, our ancestors to the point where we no longer walked on four limbs, where the hand becomes free
mm,
to be a kind of, tool making tool, where the voice no longer needs to, where we don't have massive lung sacs anymore because we don't live in the forest anymore. So we don't need to like make bellowing cries, rather like our lungs change and our voices soften and then we pick up language, or something like that. So we can read this idea of like, we like fire because we are divided from our origins. We can read that scientifically. The text allows for that.
mhm,
We can also read it, theologically, like think about all the Gnostic readings of the novel, right? I mean, this passage would also support a kind of a Gnostic reading. We are divided from our origins in the light of the good God, and we are exiles on this archon's, miscreation or something like that. So you could read it theologically, you could read it scientifically, you could read it philosophically as, you know, a kind of existentialist conception of how we are, divided from our being by being for ourselves and not just in ourselves. Our being is also kind of divided, like so just the just all of the kind of work that a figure is doing in the novel is just really wonderful to think about.
Well, this would have to do with Bohem too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Uh,
100%. Like, I mean, in the six theosophic points, how has creation come to be, and for what purpose has it come to be? Like Boehm starts in the Ungrund,
mm,
right? Kind
mhm,
of the unconsciousness of God.
mm,
And in the Ungrund, there's a will, and an I. And the will wants things that the eye sees, right? So there's a desire for creation and for God to manifest as itself, in the unconscious abyss of God that Bohm calls the Ungrund. But in order for, manifestation to begin and in order for creation to begin, there has to be a kind of will that that is a kind of destructive will, right? So Bohm has this kind of traditional Christian Trinity, but he kind of divides it in, almost like cosmically. So the Father is understood as the wrath fire, and in order for anything to appear, there has to be a kind of conflict.
Mm,
which also kind of, I guess, feeds into the judge's metaphysics of war as kind of the first principle of everything.
mm. Well,
But like fire is like the thing that, like you can't have light without fire, says
right,
Boma, and
right.
you can't have fire without the destruction of something else, and so like metaphysically and for Boma, theosophically, fire is also a very important figure. So that also like is
Hmm.
accommodated in this figure that McCarthy creates.
Yeah, well, there is something about it that fire, when you make a fire, it's all of a sudden there. Like you might be scratching on a flint, or even if you use a
Yes.
match, even
Yes.
even matches. I mean, that's why children want to play with matches. It's a hard piece of wood, and then it's fire. That
Yeah.
is, when you're pure of heart, that's quite magical.
That's amazingly put. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's just coming out of nothing, and the opposite of darkness too, right? Um, well, we are kind of scooching around the judge, because we've we move right on to the idea from whether birds navigate, and then the people are talking about whether there's alien life. Now, I thought that was also a kind of anachronism in here, and Brown is saying, or Brown,
Yeah.
the judge comes in and says, "No way," and I
Yeah.
was like, I went and Googled it. When did we think about aliens? But apparently, we have for a long time. And by long time, I mean maybe Greeks. Speaking of tragedy.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
mean, Talos, he's not from another place, but he's artificial intelligence, right? But I don't know. I mean, an alien from another planet, I just didn't think anybody would think of something like that, but
In
apparently we did.
1850. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it
Yeah.
seems so Roswell and X-Files, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. 20th
And my
century.
mother. Fear of birds. There was nothing that she didn't like to believe in. She thought Elvis was still alive and there was UFOs. So I guess that's why I was surprised. Was like, what? This just seems like right there in that two paragraphs. I'm thinking of my mother. Yeah. So they
It's
go from that, and they're like, there's no men anywhere in the universe save those upon the earth. Which is also that fits for the time where they couldn't conceive of an intelligent being other than as a humanoid, I guess. And we still kind of do that.
Oh, of course we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love it. And like here, like we have a kind of conflict of like, maybe what Foucault would call epistemes or, kind of worldviews. Like on the
Mm,
one hand, there's the mimetic worldview where, I am a microcosm of the macrocosm and everything else is also microcosmically, you know, recapitulative of the greater whole.
mm,
So there's this, so of course, like we would think that there were, and the word like is used, right? Like the
mhm,
question was then put as to whether there were on Mars or other planets in the void men or creature like them, and
mhm,
and that this the judge returned and said no. So like there is a kind of like to me like historically it's like the conflict between an earlier kind of epoch where we thought everything was mimetically entangled and responsive to everything else to a kind of like it's like going from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment.
mm,
In the Renaissance the idea of likeness was still very much dominant in the worldview, I guess. But by the Enlightenment, with the advent of reason and the, um, more scientific in our terms, like trying to the greater emphasis not on similarity but on identity and difference.
mm,
The judge is basically saying the judge isn't saying that there are no aliens,
mm.
but they're saying there's nothing like what's on Earth in any other place because it's a different place.
Oh yeah, okay.
But I feel like, like when I read that his incredible quote, the truth about the world is that anything is possible.
Right.
Have you not seen it all from birth, and thereby blooded of its strangeness? It would appear to you for what it is. A hat trick and a medicine show, a fevered dream, a trance bepopulate with chimeras, having neither analogue nor precedent, an itinerant carnival, a migratory tent show whose ultimate destination, after many a pitch and many a mudded field, is unspeakable and calamitous beyond reckoning. This is
Mm,
great. Like, it's so wonderful on so many levels because, on
mm,
the one hand, he's saying that there are no analogs, in the
Mm.
world. But then he lists a series of analogs. That's like in a medicine show, a fever drink. He's trying to create figures, like so it's like it's a very rhetorical move where he's creating analog after analog in denial of, the primacy of the analog in the world.
And it's like a theater curtain opening up because he's setting the stage for for the next few minutes or the next half hour. He's about to be. This is like him.
Oh, right,
Fever
exactly.
dream.
Yes.
He's
Yes.
setting up this incredible migratory tent show. And in fact, the tent show is existing as a street performance without the tent. So it's kind of amazing.
Awesome.
He's,
Yeah.
he's almost hypnotizing them. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he
So,
moves
so
into,
like,
I love this, the universe is no narrow thing. So he says, no, there's
yeah.
no life on other planets like Earth, but then he goes, anything's possible. Like, so he is fucking
But
with
it's,
heads in a lot of ways.
but in a beautiful way. I think like here's one of the way like times when I'm like, I think I can kind of get behind what the judge is saying, and I kind
Uh,
of, or I can't see beyond the shadow of what he's saying, right? Like,
yeah.
but it, like on the one hand, it seems to be a kind of enlightenment refutation of the similarity of all things.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, it is so similar to other kinds of statements. Like, I kept thinking, because I'm like working on something to do with William Blake, I
Oh.
kept thinking of like, Blake's proverb from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where, he says something like, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it is, infinite. Basically, he's kind of
Mm.
saying the same thing, right? Had you not seen it all from birth, and thereby blooded of a strangeness, it would appear to you as this, right? It is a kind of like clean your doors of perception, and you will see the world as something incredible, right?
Mhm.
Like something that you can't imagine or that can't be compared to anything else. It's really like it's a lot like it's a Blakean kind of sentiment, you
Yeah,
know.
it is actually very
Looks like
affirming. It's very affirming, kind of believe in, you see the magic of the world, which is kind of surprising coming from the judge.
it is, yeah, yeah. But it's also like the narrative, like basically disagrees with him at every point, right? When the judge says, there's nothing, that repeats, basically. He's
Hmm.
kind of making that claim. Maybe, or that there is no need for repetition. But he's saying that in a novel that is composed of variations on themes, like that is just basically all variations of, a fairly finite set of themes, to
Hmm.
do bigger issues like the origin of humanity, and like violence, and more historical issues like, America's coming into being. So he like the narrative is like constantly providing us with analogs and precedents, and like, and basically like giving us variations of the same metaphors over and over and over again. And the judge is denying that that happens in the universe. So is this one way in which you can draw a distinction between the judge and the perspectives of the judge and the narrative? Because that's sort of what we all want to do, right?
Mm.
We can't let the judge have the final word.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, this is where it gets very hard for me. This whole part with the judge, like it's like uh, partly amazing and partly suspicious for me. I guess I'm turning into oh, I wanted to mention, I forgot. So when we hear the part, this is going to tie in, I'm not going too far away. When we hear about Glanton at the end of it, he says across from him sat the vast aberrance of the judge. Now I took it as like this, transgression, a horrible thing. But you suggest maybe there could be a double meaning on aberrance. It doesn't necessarily mean you abhor him, right? Or you hate him, but or hatefulness
Well,
of the judge.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I sort of like to abhor, I guess, is sort of like it just maybe reminded me of like the idea of abjection.
Okay. Yeah.
It's like something absolutely repulsive. It's nonetheless fascinating and
Yeah.
weirdly. active, and
Yeah.
so, Julia Kristeva would say, like, in a state of abjection, subject can't be distinguished from object.
Mm.
And, like, the human is the corpse, and you are the shit and the vomit
Yeah.
that you expel from your body, and all that sort of stuff. Like, so we, like, we are repulsed by the judge, but also the judge is like constantly, he's like an apparatus of capture. We're
Mm.
constantly, or a black hole, that we're
Mm.
constantly like being dragged into, and sort of like it's hard to separate ourselves from the judge, and it's hard to separate the novel from the judge and everything from the judge.
Good times. Yes. Yes. I like the shit and everything. Just sitting around the corner from our transition to dying. Um but I was surprised that it's the first time that the narrator, or whether it was Glanton's thoughts, kind of cast a judgment on the
Exactly.
judge.
Yes.
And then we come up on this part where he's going to start to talk about the universe, and he's talking away, and Davy Brown spat into the fire. That's more of your craziness, he said. And I
Yeah.
was like, whoa, there's another rebellion, if you will, a resistance. And the kid also just sat and watched the judge at the fire. So I'm seeing now the shine or the gleam or the magic of the judge is
Right.
maybe fading
Yes.
for these guys.
Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that he's going to fade for anybody else, but there's something the gang is kind of like, eh. Um, and the
We
judge,
know your bullshit.
yeah, we know you're bullshit. And then he places his hand on his chest, the judge does, and he steps closer and he holds up one hand. And the next thing we know, we're getting a magic trick.
Yeah.
And quite a professionally done one, it sounds like. It's a coin that he throws up and seems to send into the desert and come back again. And I thought this was interesting in terms of him becoming a vertical figure, a axis mundi, if you will. And in the desert, we associate with this incredible, like, the stereotype of Jim Morrison went into the desert because it's spiritual, and you're gonna see truth in God and yourself, right? And yet this judge is out there professing now, and a little bit like a fat Jim Morrison, if you will.
With alopecia
With
and
alopecia, that's right.
albinism.
That's right. And I love it because he's going
But
to
he
turn.
can fiddle, so there is that
There's
musician
the
talent.
music there, yeah. And so he's going to start this coin. It's flipping between his fingers, and I love it when a magician does that. I always kind of wish I'd learned how to do it. Where's the
Yeah,
coin,
that's a tough one.
Davy? And then Davy says, "I'll notify you where to put the coin."
Right.
I love it because it's Hollerback, right? So these
Yeah.
he's not taking it. And he proceeds to do this magic act. And how's your feeling about this? I mean, I love it, and I resent him for it.
Well, I think it's like, when I'm just looking at it, and it's sort of like he uses the magic trick to illustrate a point or something
Hmm.
with, like, the order in creation which you see is that which you have put there, like a string in a maze, so you shall not lose your way. For existence has its own order, and that no man's mind can compass, the mind itself being but a fact among others. I don't, and then he switches to the magic trick. So I feel like there's a
Yeah,
connection between what he's
absolutely.
what he's saying or claiming, and then what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Because, David Brown brought it up by saying they talk about the false moon. And then this coin is kind of like a moon. It's going to be shining in the sky too. It's flying around. And he is saying anything's possible. A trance be populated. And now he's going to do his magic show. To me,
yeah,
it just takes away his power. There's something funny that I really enjoy about magicians and some of their memoirs. It's not uncommon for a young magician to get involved with criminal activity, because they can become card dealers and card sharks. They can, obviously the grift is like the shell game of they take, you can go on the subway or the L train in Chicago and they'll ask for $50 and do the ball under the cups. And you know
yeah.
what? People do it and they
Oh yeah,
lose their
yeah.
$50. I just don't
And
understand, right?
yeah,
But
they kind
yeah,
of want to see how, the
yeah. I think, that's it. The mark wants to be a mark.
Yeah.
They want to see how it's done. And there is something, sometimes I want to know how a magic act is done, and sometimes I want to think about how it is and how I would do it. And that is part of the fun. That's the kabuki theater of it, right?
So he does say, like, the arc of circling bodies is determined by the length of their tether.
Mm,
Moons, coins, men, right? Like, this is a
yes.
pretty famous
Yes.
thing. So, like, what is he saying there exactly? It does have some, I feel like it has something to do with, like he says, like, creation has an order unto itself. So he actually is not a philosopher of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
It does have some kind of order, but he's a Kantian. He says, like, the mind can't encompass the order of the universe because the mind is just a fact in the universe. So the mind itself is a kind of limited thing, so it can't ever, become one with that order, with the actual order of the universe. But he says, I think he says elsewhere, like, that's no reason to despair,
Mm-hmm.
right? You still nonetheless have to, because the least thing can kill you in creation. You should try to know everything,
Mm-hmm.
even though that that is doomed to failure, right? But you nonetheless still have to try to know everything, and that would be like the length of your tether, is like how much do you know about creation so
Oh,
that you can,
yeah.
like, it's a kind of like he's like the Nietzschean Übermensch, right? Like he tries to do everything, like, and he seems to be able to do a
Mhm.
lot of things, right? Like he can not, he's in the visual arts, he can sketch, he's in the
Mhm.
plastic arts, he's a storyteller and a musician, like, or whatever, like, so he can do everything. And of course, he's the one least affected by fate.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
that's true.
But-
Certainly, I find people like that absolutely fascinating that can have several skills. They are fascinating. They do seem really, really interesting. And they do seem to know something and they seem to enjoy life maybe more than some of us do, you know? Um, or others. He seemed to
But
be. But he
it's
does.
also great the way that the gang, of course, totally mistrusts him, right? Like, you can't be a prophet in your own community because everybody knows your tricks and all that sort of stuff, right? So, but I love the way it's described as, like, some of them were looking at the judge to make sure he wasn't palming
Mhm.
another coin, and some of them were looking off where the other coin went, and together they formed a common witness. I
Mhm.
just, again, which makes me think this is another iteration of that figure of the witness, and it's
Yes.
also a collective witness, and they're not, they're witnessing the totality of an event, but from different perspectives. I don't know, like, I also feel like it's another interesting take on the witness.
Yeah, I agree with you. And um and he doesn't give a speech right now. There's a day between it. I forgot. I thought it happened right now, but I'm just seeing now that they actually carry on their travel. But there's a lot of things in here, like cunning old Malabary stuff,
Yeah.
are just not they're not swallowing it. And I think it was a mistake for him in a way. You do this magic trick, and now we they can see you have this gift. You're telling all this so-called wisdom about the universe, and now it's like, no, there's no reason to believe you because even your speech and the way that you speak is part of your magic act. And he does have that very florid type of way of talking. So,
Yeah, and I mean that also comes through, like, in the discussion about war
hmm
as well, right? Like, I mean, so he's like trying to say, the what the universe is, and then he can't really say the actual reference. It's almost like a catachresis, right? There is no word for what the universe is, so you have to be rhetorical. Well, it's a tent show, it's this, it's that, it's that,
hmm
you can never get to the thing that your simile or your metaphor is pointing toward. Like, it's just impossible. That's the sort of inherent frustration of allegorical desire. But when he talks about war, what is war? Well, war is war. War is a trade. War is a game. Like, again, the kind of proliferation of, like, um, terms and concepts and images to try to pin down what he's actually talking about. Again, he's sort of like, again, we're in the same situation. Like, so like, why does he call war a trade? And then why does he call it a game? And um, what do you make of like the way he relates it to game and play, and the way he relates it
Well,
to trade?
I don't agree with everything he says, but I do like how this is after days of travel again, where they were losing weight and they didn't have food. And I'm thinking about when you kidnap someone or put them into initiation, you have food pulled back. They're in tough shape, and then they get into this campsite again, and they're biovacking or something, and there they go. The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword, said the black after the judge says something about the subject was war. And the judge smiled, and this is where he comes in. And I I see that the good book does indeed count war and evil, said Irving, yet there's many a bloody tale of war inside of it. And then the judge seems to say this is a misunderstanding, that war is actually our real true calling, and it's how we measure our worth. And this probably one of the most quoted sections online, in the front of Black Hawk Down. I think it's in there. I mean,
Is
it's
it really?
yeah, yeah, it's so quoted. Ask, it makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way and not some other way. For me, this is exactly the power of language and the part of where language this is where it's a malignant virus. If William Burroughs says it's a virus, it's a malignant one, certainly in the use of control. Because I would choose to read this. Let's say this: it makes no difference what men think of art, said the judge. Art endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. Art was always here. Before man was, art waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. This is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way. I think you could replace that word with anything, the word art, and you could make it's the style of writing that makes it sound important, not that it's true. And I think that's really the sense of the judge, is that he has a way of presenting things that make it sound like he knows the truth. And the guys argue about this. And they do argue with it being a trade. I only would consider war a trade because you're going to make somebody's going to make money by it. But really, war is an emergency response to conflict. War is an emergency response to resource scarcity, and so is farming. We didn't have we picked these things up sometimes because we were running out of supplies. And we've talked about this earlier in the podcast, that there isn't one kind of war. There's so many types of warfare, and there were wars that were very theatrical. In that way, it would be a game where it was all acted out and maybe no one died. Hundreds and hundreds of people fighting, but it was there for the entertainment of it. And maybe only one person would die, and people would eat lunch and watch it. Um, there's many societies that would do anything to avoid war. It would be a last desperate um, event. The reason I also don't agree with it being a game, he describes it as a game. He describes children that play alone don't really believe it. That is actually not true. If anyone's watched their kid, I mean, not all kids have strong imaginations, but most do. The kid is so involved in their play, they would prefer to have a friend. They would prefer if their parent played with them. But more times out of if they don't have a playmate, they will get into building blocks and castles and play with dragons in their room and pillow fights with themselves if they have to. Um, Anthropologically, Marvin Harris, going way back, about war, and he's a cultural materialist. That's not everyone's cup of tea. Um, I'm sure that I can think of a few academics in McCarthy that don't like anthropology or think it's not right, but I would say that a sport is a marriage of art and war. It's not that war is the ultimate. It's that war is one way to approach playing a game. And it's true that when you play poker or card games, there is more excitement when you put money in the table. I have friends that we're not going to play euchre, or they're not going to play poker unless we actually bet, even if it's just uh, a $20. And that it's hard to take that away. You don't want to lose your money. But I can play crib and canasta without betting money. I can play those for hours. Um, so I don't know when he says, suppose two men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. I just don't think that's necessary. I think it's a lack of imagination and it's a lack of passion. There's nothing like beating your friend at a game of cards. It feels good.
Yeah.
Um,
He seems to like want to, he seems to elevate war because war is the truest form of divination. Like
mm-hmm,
I'm trying to like
mm,
grasp why he goes to the idea of like staking your life on a game.
mm-hmm,
Like so, you and I we're playing Russian roulette, and like whoever loses, that is again kind of like that is a kind of mimesis of God's will. Like
mm,
because and again he puts it in like this sort of German romantic or post-Kantian conception of the will. Like will is very important in this novel as a
yes,
concept.
yes.
So like it doesn't matter like what we say to each other. So in a way, language doesn't matter. Like moral law is basically like a linguistic thing,
Hmm.
and it basically like it doesn't really matter because when we put our lives at stake and, he says something like the argument is trivial. So language is trivial, but not the separate wills made manifest in this kind of like wager. So the wills made manifest, the will to, I guess, live or the will to be selected by the larger will, like again, the judge he's not exactly like a natural scientist because he still thinks that, nature, there's a larger will in nature, that can become manifest through these forms of divination,
Hmm.
whether it's looking into a fire or playing, a game of Russian roulette.
Hmm. Yeah. Russian roulette is very interesting. I've also known somebody who played Russian roulette, and they certainly were not in the best of their time of their life. They were going through a phase of alienation, feeling existential angst, and did not connect their passions to their practical life. I certainly think it's a form of suicide. It doesn't I used to try to research it. It's very hard to research the statistic on people playing Russian roulette because it just gets classified under suicide or accidental death. So we don't have a lot of really good numbers on how many people are playing that kind of a risk. The idea that I see it more like cutting. Now that tends to be gender to women, cutting themselves, but I do see it like, please wake me up. I feel numb. And I think some of our society and the drive for civilization can make you feel numb. However, the gang doesn't feel that way, because they feel if all else fails, these guys are having a ball. At the beginning of the novel, they're having the best time of their life doing this. So in that way, I can see that the judge might consider a war being so passionate. It's really a question of what makes you feel that pulse in life.
Yes.
I think back, I can think of a completely benign, maybe not for everybody, form of war when we first were on the forum, the McCarthy forum. And, I think of all the pretty horses and his fame and popularity, McCarthy's arising and emerging at the same time as the domestic internet. So we discover this forum, and there was a lot of friendly competition on it. We were often ribbing people. Rick Wallach, one of the most ribald, and there was a kind of enthusiasm that we could get angry and be a little bit poking fun at each other, a little bit angry, pissed off if somebody didn't listen to us, or they said something completely that was morally upsetting to us. And you're sitting there typing away for a couple of hours, and then you get a good one in. So there is a reward in that there was a form of mental competition, if you will, or trying to prove your point. Like a debate team, I suppose. But
But
on the
the judge would say that like yeah, I love that. The judge would say that that activity on the forum was a kind of sport,
yes,
right? 'Cause we're
yes,
just competing with our linguistic skills.
yes, yeah,
But the judge would say, well, why don't you just set aside, your interpretations of Blood Meridian and turn a card, and whoever loses,
Hmm.
they have to remove
Hmm.
themselves from existence.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, the boring act of turning a card would become more interesting. That certainly would be true because you're being put into the moment. All of a sudden, you're completely a Buddhist. Oh, wow, all of a sudden yeah, because if you just turn a coin, that is boring. But when you just turn a card, that would be a boring activity for sure. That would not be a fun game. You have to have a win and lose and obviously we teach children to be good sports about it, you know.
well, for
Uh,
me, the judge, I don't like he conflates war and games.
yes.
And he says that the ultimate state of the game is basically war, or like a game of Russian roulette, or what he's actually talking about, this turning of the card and blah blah
Mm-hmm.
blah.
Mm-hmm.
But like, if you stake your life on something,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's no longer a game, because a game like is something that you a game is like, in a way, a kind of, you're creating a space, like a heterocosm outside of normal reality that you enter into freely, and you can exit freely, right? Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to play now,
Mm-hmm.
and it's my choice, and I'm going to do it as long as I want, and then I'm going to go.
Yeah.
And I can quit at any time.
Yeah.
So there's an element of freedom in play that gets I don't know, abrogated by staking one's life. Because when you stake your life, now it's necessity, it's not freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Right now I have to win,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise I'm going to die.
Mm-hmm. And
And
it's
so, like,
mm,
it's, in that case, war is not a game at all. Like, I mean, and also, like, in terms of, like, who went to war, you
mm-hmm.
know like, I agree, like, in a way, like the Glanton gang, like, they have this incredible solidarity about them, right? Like, when they meet the Sonorans,
Mm-hmm.
Blanton's like totally like scoffing at these uh, guys, and that feeling was communicated to the entire body, right? Like, they
Mm-hmm.
are a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful kind of utopian image of solidarity
Mm-hmm.
and freedom to do whatever the fuck you want, and
Mm-hmm.
you accept all consequences, and it doesn't matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something beautiful about that. But,
Well,
like, I also think that, um, who goes to war? Like, you're drafted into war, or you're poor, or like, you don't have a choice, but you sign up for the military. And the
mm-hmm.
military it's never really like the Glanton gang, right? Like, the
No.
Glanton gang is like this war machine
Yeah.
that it can't control, right? It's like a genie out of the bottle,
Yeah.
and they just do whatever they want. And no military unit is like that, really. Like, they
No.
all have to answer to governments, and it's like morons in the government, sending people off to war, and that's not freedom, right?
No,
That's
I think yeah, and you're making a good point. That's why the analogy to Vietnam War has often come up over the years to the novel. Because that's the kind of public image we have, and we've talked about that during here, that they really didn't go around killing lots of babies, but we have this perception of it. You know what I'm reminded of, and we've talked a little bit about it on our production meeting, was you've just reminded me of Project Hail Mary. There's a moment, and I hope people have seen it. I think you'll really like it. It's a really fun movie, and it's got some interesting moments. But my favorite part of the movie is that they need someone to go to space because there's some kind of I don't know if it's an alien or a micro bug. It's something we don't I can't remember what it was, but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
threatening
yeah.
the Earth. It's
It's an
going to
astrophage,
thank you. It's going to
star
kill the
eater.
right, it's going to star eater. It's going to eat the sun. So they need somebody, and this scientist has written about things and he teaches high school. He did his PhD, and this is a very appealing as well because you've done yours and that terrible initiation and all the hard work it takes to get that. And he's done this, but he's chosen that he didn't get the kind of professorship job that he had or something, or his paper was denounced. So he is a teacher, and they want him to go into space. There's nobody else to go, and he's basically a coward. You could label him that way, but he's afraid. I think it's too rude. I think in the novel though he is really cowardly, but he does not want to go. He doesn't want to go and he thinks they're crazy to send him up. He's not equipped. He's not able to do it. But the thing is, they frickin' knock him out and put him in a coma and they send him. For me, that's a great metaphor for for free choice of women's bodies and for the military draft. And then something else happens. So he goes into space, and when he wakes up, he has no clue why he's there. He has to kind of evaluate. He doesn't even remember that he didn't volunteer. That comes out throughout we don't know that right
Yeah,
away either. But the
that was a
scene of,
cool structure.
yeah, yeah, you're right. And we find out that the horrible, to me, that was a terrifying moment of him being forced. And the fear, I felt that claustrophobic fear. But what's interesting is that he then gets a second climax. When he's in space, he's about to go home and send back all the stuff to help. They save the day. He meets an alien, another species, not unlike the Homo naledi. But he meets another species and they become friends. But he has a moment where he's connected. He feels confidence. He knows his skills and he decides not to go home and he sacrifices his life willingly. His choice is made by himself. And that it makes all the difference in the world, being able to have a choice to do something. And war is not like that. I mean, draft is not like that. And basically this kid is kind of in war because he has to fight for his life. But I love this idea of choice. And certainly these guys, do they have choice? They've seemed to be enjoying themselves in the novel. But the judge has the hierarchy out of order. He says that the war is the hierarchy, and that's why I argued no, art and the hierarchy is game. That's the ultimate. Because part of our survival, the element of surprise, the science of surprise, is locked into magic, into art making and competing in and certainly in a safe environment. There's no problem with that. We do have the emotional capacity to enjoy a card game without gambling our lives. We can gamble money, you know, we can gamble toothpicks or something. I mean, I'm sure families are out there not teaching their kids to do that. But he's
Or
got it wrong. It's the game and the sport is really, I would replace the word war in that paragraph with game. And look at, I think we have evidence of it now, long after this novel's done, how much gaming is a cultural creative force in our society. If you want to look at art and you think there's not very much art being made, it's being made in the gaming community, in creating these games and these alternate worlds. And the costuming and the landscaping and the formatting of these play areas on our TV screens, you know. Um, so I think he's wrong. I think he sounds incredible. He sounds definitely like he knows what he's talking about, but he's doing it. Why is he doing this?
Well, yeah, why is he doing it?
What's his
But
motive here?
what is McCarthy's motive in writing this speech also? So, I mean, I actually agree 100% that every child knows that play is nobler than work.
Hmm.
I think that's right.
It is right. And
And,
Montessori did that. She based all of her schooling on putting tools out the kids play with.
yeah,
And they don't realize they're learning while they're playing.
he has different arguments. On the one hand, it's like war waited, for the human species to emerge. And that's like a metaphysical
Hmm.
claim that war is baked into the structure of the universe, or
Hmm. Hmm.
and so everything is at war. So it's very like metaphysical, like a
Hmm.
pre-Socratic sort of thinking, like war is the father of all things.
Hmm.
But then he kind of makes like I don't know, like maybe it's like a anthropological argument. He says, war endures because young men love it and old men love it in them, right? So
Yes.
that's a totally different argument.
It is.
And to me, like you can read that sort of like paleoanthropologically or whatever, like, in Whales and Men, like McCarthy will say about the human that, we're descended from primates and primates are very warring. You look at chimpanzee society social behavior, and it's pretty crazy, like the way they can attack people that are like other chimpanzees that are somehow been outed of the community. But McCarthy will also say we also learn from a hunting species.
Mm-hmm.
And the more noble part of humanity comes from not our primate ancestry but from the prehistorical learning from hunting species, right? And
Right.
it's
So,
sort of also, it's also, I think it was like Octavia Butler who said,
yes,
the tragedy of the human is that, we're gifted with intelligence, but we're also hierarchical. And, the hierarchy comes from our our primate ancestry.
right.
So when he says like war endures because men love it, young men love it, and old men love it in them, that's almost like, war endures because we are not past our simian ancestry, right? We're still apes, you know.
Sure. And
So
I'm
then like he's just like these two things don't connect. Like war as a metaphysical structure of the universe and war as like archaic remnant of our primate ancestry. Like it's not the same. So he's making a bunch of different arguments, um, and I think they sound coherent, but I'm not
Yes.
sure if
Yes,
they
I
are.
think that's it. That's why I say the coin magic trick is a metaphor for this
Yes,
upcoming talk he does. It is
awesome.
theater. It's theater. He's performative. And the thing is, he's actually wrong because those chimpanzee reports are chimpanzees that have their habitat threatened. They aren't living in the same, Jane Goodall, yes, she observed the chimpanzees, but she's there for one thing. And just like the judge is saying that the observer, and he's quoting the observer affects the experiment, right? But we can't observe our own mind because we're part of it. But those chimpanzees and all those things, same as um, Rwanda with the gorillas there, Gorillas in the Mist and Diane Fossey, is that their habitat is encroached on. Of course they are not. Of course they're going to be violent. They need to get food and feed their family, and they have hierarchy and they have protocol, and that's threatened when they're running out of space. Um, I don't have a problem with hierarchy and human beings. That part it doesn't bother me. I mean, because if you have a benevolent king, I'm okay with it. As long as the crops are growing and everyone's distributed. That's why we've talked about circus economy in the past. The ringleader of a circus is only the ringleader as long as all of the people that travel with him in the traveling show have schooling for their kids and clothing. As soon as that ringleader doesn't div distribute the money fairly, he doesn't have a performative crew. So the judge he's just wrong. One to compare that old men love the young men fighting. Some do, some are sick. The people that are part of war culture would love that. And now to admire the athletics in the Olympics and old men like the Olympics, yeah, that would be one thing. I get it, but it doesn't have to be just that. I think that this is a very warped way of looking at humanity. I don't trust him. And I don't think he's up to any good. Maybe he wants to keep them in the gang and he wants to keep them fighting and under him and saving their day. I think that might be his motive.
I don't know. Like I think, like there is like so games of sport
Uh-huh,
are skill based.
uh-huh.
Like there is an element of chance that must exist in every game of sport, but like there are agonistic games, and war would be agon in some ways, right? Like it is competition. And
Mhm.
so he seems to prefer, competition, skill-based games over games of chance. But nonetheless, like his ultimate example is a game of chance, right? Like
Yes.
flipped a card and then we'll see who dies, right? Like, so there is something like in chance that again, he's not like he has a kind of theology, right? Like he's sort of looking for God. It's almost as if, all of the awful things that he does are kind of like theurgical acts, right? He wants to see, like, are you going to stop me if I do this?
Mhm.
Uh, and like, and he keeps living, right? And even
Yep.
at the very end of the novel, he's described by the narrator as a great favorite.
Yes.
So he has this kind of theology. He does believe in some kind of greater will
Right.
that seems to favor him and all he does.
Oh,
You know, and war is somehow the thing that makes that will manifest, the most clearly.
Absolutely. And I think that this is really the heart of the creation of the judge. Um, if we don't know if you read the novel and you're looking at the novel, for me, he is, for lack of a better word, he's evil. And he's the worst part of life on earth. He's the actual reason why life is shitty for so many people. So when he says that war is there and it endures, why am I taking him seriously when he's a pedophile, evil murderer, and not the same as the other? He's not on the same track as the kid and Glanton of the gang, and that's why they're sick of him. So if it isn't that you can figure that out by reading the novel that he's evil, and I'm willing to negotiate a Christian idea, Christian Judea idea of evil. It's not where I come from. He's a hungry ghost. He's very, very bad. But Cormac McCarthy in his notes said, or in his interview as well, said he describes him as gestalt evil. So it's this, never stopping, never resting evil. And as soon as you accept that he's evil and he's wrong, then you look at his words differently. Does it mean that he's not powerful? No, he is very, very powerful. He can get away with everything and he can trick everybody. But you have to remember that he's absolutely on the wrong side of history. Like, he's evil. It's like saying, I care about what Jeffrey Dahmer says, or I care about what Ted Bundy said. I never thought that people should interview. Let's find out why Ted Bundy kills people. He's not going to tell us. You know, I didn't know until recently that most of these serial killers fuck corpses. They go back and have sex with the women that they've killed. I had no idea because I think they really kept that from the public. And I've been down with serial killers for a long, long time. It really wasn't until I read a book called Murderland, where she writes about lead poisoning on the West Coast where I grew up. And I had no idea that it was pretty much part of being a serial killer. I thought Jeffrey Dahmer was like an anomaly.
Hmm.
Apparently not. And that it's funny because we've kind of toyed with this idea. There was a word when you were describing the sensuousness, and I wanted to say the word glycine. And I think it means when you're sexually aroused by entrails. I'm probably fucking that word up so badly, but there's a condition. It's
It is interesting that you link necrophilia to our discussion of the judge, because I think then immediately of Lester Ballard from Child of
Mhm,
God.
mhm.
And, when you say evil, if I were like a psychoanalyst,
Yeah,
I would say perversity.
thank you. That's better.
Like it
Yeah,
is kind of like the judge, all of these guys are like killing and slaughtering and probably also like having sex with corpses
yeah,
and blah, blah, blah. Like, but they're almost like, innocent in their devilishness,
I
as
agree.
maybe Kafka would say.
Yeah,
But like the judge is perversely so. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like there's a kind of willingness
yes,
to the judge's deeds that makes him a little bit different.
yes.
But
I
like
completely
probably
agree.
unlike Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy or actual serial killers, the actual serial killers would probably be really totally inarticulate. They
Hmm.
would not be interesting to listen to.
No, they're not.
Judge, the judge, of course, really is. So in
Hmm.
that case, he's an impossible figure, right? Like
Yeah.
because he is truly a literary creation because we can attend to him and nonetheless kind of like, by okay, this is like a pedophile serial killer, like genocide
Mm.
or, blah blah blah, like talking, but I can take him seriously and he's very articulate and he's like a
Yeah.
master of words, like so he's totally impossible. So
Yes.
it's like a double agent almost. Like I should probably like try to figure out a good way to present this idea in our podcast, but like he's a kind of a sadist in the literary sense of like he is like the articulate anti-heroes of the Marquis de Sade's
Yes.
work, right? And of course, Cormac McCarthy looks like a children's
Hmm.
writer
Yeah.
compared to Marquis de Sade in many ways. Like, but he's kind of like a Sadian character, and
Hmm.
like um, there's at least one really interesting way that Saad's work has been characterized, and it would work in the ideas of perversity and evil. And it's via like Gilles Deleuze's study of the difference between masochism and sadism
Mm,
in an early work of his called Coldness and Cruelty, which is
okay.
mainly a study of Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, right? Whom
Of course.
whom
No, I did not
Leopold
know
no
that.
no whom Leopold Bloom from Joyce's Ulysses
Oh,
named
right. Right.
Masoch, right? Because Bloom is he's
Oh,
kind of a masochist.
yeah, yeah.
The judge is a sadist, so it's almost like McCarthy's like, well, I'm going to take my model Joyce, but Joyce already did the masochist par excellence. He wrote the Epic of Peace, so I'm going to write the satire of war with a sadist at its heart.
Thank you. That's exactly where I'm trying to get to, is if you don't take a stand on who he is, you don't realize this is an anti-war novel. And that is where confusion comes. Why I would have put that quote at the beginning of Black Hawk Down. I think Mark Bowden probably thought he was doing a good thing or something, but for me I've never really understood why you would do that. It seems so inappropriate.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and he's a great writer. I read the book and I love the movie. But yeah, I think that unless you're willing to find out who he is, I love the term perversity and sadism. You know, I really wasn't meaning to use the word evil, but that's McCarthy's word. Just alt evil. If you don't
Oh, I think
understand
that
that,
works.
it does. You cannot understand the novel. Because if you sit here and think, oh, it all makes sense, and yeah, old men love it, I might as well say, the reason we have beauty pageants is because young women love them and old women love looking at them. Well, you would think I was an asshole if I said that, wouldn't you? Like, what kind of a feminist am I? You know? And when he says that to me, that's also revealing how evil and wrong he is. It's sexist and it's inappropriate pressure on men. It's disgusting, and that's no reason to have war. It's certainly maybe a European superiority um, ethnocentric reason to have war. And again, what we watch in this novel is that this idea, this Western expansion to civilize America and bring all this stuff is this is the most cliche and obvious response to Blood Meridian is that it was actually really ugly and horrible. And I think that's what its main thrust was when it first came out, is that we're finding out that, that's why it would be considered revisionist in some way, is that,
Yeah,
we had the romantic Westerns. No, we're going to actually show it now.
yeah.
And,
I
and
can't help. I just thought of I want to like also redeem something about the judge's privileging of war too, right? Like because again, I think you have to take it at different levels and the idea of war, and not all of these levels are going to coordinate or be coherent or in agreement, right? Like so I thought of like Zora Neale Hurston's description or her statement, and she was an anthropologist as well, like as a writer, but she says discord is more natural than accord.
Mm,
And so like like while rejecting the idea of, corporeal warfare between nations for resource extraction purposes or whatever, like that just, like you mentioned William Burroughs, I think it's at the beginning of his Western Place of Dead Roads
oh, I love
where
it.
he talks about, in the coming space society, war is like banned as flat out insane, right? Like, but then he goes on and writes a novel about like gunslingers who are
Uh-huh.
killing everybody, like, so it's sort of like, there's something about discord or like, and maybe this also goes to McCarthy's idea that harmony is a dangerous idea. It's not that we can ever, um, it's not like pluribus where we all become one entity, but surely we can transcend physical warfare as a kind of zero-sum game, right? Like, and I just taught a course on comedy, and we read a great essay by an ethologist, I think, named Joseph Meeker, who
Mm,
talks about tragedy is actually very culturally specific and it's ideological. Not every society
mhm.
on Earth, human society, has a kind of version of tragedy. It came out of Greece, it impacted Western Europe, and it impacted English-speaking North America and well, Spanish-speaking South America, because it's European. But like not every culture in the world has tragedy, but every culture in the world has comedy. And
Mhm.
tragedy is always like a zero-sum game where it's like you versus me and it's one or zero. Like either I'm one, I win, or I'm zero, I've lost. Either I'm alive or I'm dead. Whereas, for Meeker, the comic mode is not like it's not about winning and losing. It's about uh, accommodating differences and we don't harmonize in a like a climax ecosystem which has the maximum diversity of species. All the species aren't getting along, they're eating each other and blah blah blah. But it's like everyone is small enough to like to accommodate everything else.
Yeah.
So it's comedy is about survival, whereas tragedy is about emerging victorious or being dead. And so
Oh, that is so interesting to me. And I want to think about that for a second. I feel as if the approach to tragedy in the way that it is sad and literal is what is unique to the European tradition. I think there are stories, there's Robert Brighurst, he was a typologist. Is that a word, typologist? And he wrote an incredible he transcribed Haida myths in BC, and the stories have a strange crossover to go to the argument of tectonic plates almost, that the stories have actually traveled in the same way. Now, they do have some common crossovers with some Greek stories, but the response to them is different. In that way, I would say that in Europe, they lost the secret history of those stories. When the first three times I read Hamlet, very sad, very crying, very depressed. I don't cry when I look at Hamlet anymore because it is a story about regeneration, that there was something wrong with the kingdom. There's something wrong with even Hamlet's father probably had something wrong with him, and his vengeance for it was to venge for something that already had something wrong. It wasn't just on Claudius. And it's really, for me, a celestial metaphor for rebooting the we can't if we don't understand that the stars have to realign, we don't understand that the earth has to realign in the plants and the king back to that king, if the king and the ringleader of the circus isn't taking care of its people, they're fucked up and the plants don't grow. I mean, there's a mythology that if there's something wrong with the king, all the fields go dry.
the Fisher King that
Right.
Eliot based the wasteland on.
Yes, exactly. And the mythology of perhaps in other societies, the Sumerian myths, um, those are astral myths. The Sumerian stories and many of the fairy tales that we have, and there's crossover with Haida stories like some of our fairy tales, and those are possibly astral myths. They're the accounting of, for me, the judge ultimately is the sun in the sky. For me, that's how I feel about him. So, that's why I'm laughing that I'm calling him evil. Of course, he would like war. Of course, he would like force. He is a forceful, his nature of the sun is forceful upon us. That's that story about the wind and the sun. The wind thinks it's stronger than the sun, but the guy just holds onto his coat more. When the sun comes out, takes his coat, you know? And then
Just have
Anton.
to maintain the correct distance from the judge in order
Exactly.
to
And then
thrive.
literally in No Country for Old Men, McCarthy makes sure we know that Anton Sugar is a son. He arrives in town in a heat wave, I've said that in the past. And his face is in the sky on the movie poster, coming up on dawn while Moss is running from him. And it occurs at the same time as a very famous heat wave in Texas in that town. So, but it doesn't mean that we don't feel the emotional value of the story. Of course we do. So yeah, I think that the way to understand the story is to try to figure out what the judge is. I love the sadist thing. I love the um, perversity part of it too. Is whatever it takes for us to realize we cannot trust this guy. We shouldn't be listening to his words and take
Yeah.
it seriously.
Like speaking of, I guess, sadists and perverts
Yeah,
and Germans,
good times.
um, like I think of Carl Schmidt, who was
Tell me
like
who
a
that is, please. I just have to unplug my student.
He was a lawyer in Weimar, Germany, that
Okay.
eventually kind of like he was not fired by the Nazis, and
Hmm.
he wrote a lot of stuff before and after World War II, and basically kind of like not fired by the Nazi means you're a Nazi. So he was like a jurist and a kind of political theorist during that period of German history. And he has a, very famous definition of politics. He says, politics is like morality, is like art. It's a kind of way of distinguishing things. So art, you distinguish between the beautiful and the ugly. Morality, you distinguish between, good and evil. And in politics, you distinguish at a collective level, not at an individual level, between friend and enemy. So this is how he understood politics, right? And you have your friends and you have your enemies, and sort of like Nietzsche's kind of slave morality, like Schmidt thought that, and like the judge, right, thinks that what defines us or what bonds us is who our enemies are first, right? So first of all, you determine what evil is, and then you only determine what good is. So like that's the way Carl Schmitt defined politics as the art of distinguishing between friends and enemies.
Yeah.
Now you could have like a totally different kind of view of politics, which is not really distinguishing between friend, and that would be like a tragic view,
Mhm.
distinguishing between friend and enemy, because you want your friends to live and you want your enemies to die, right? So it's again a zero sum kind of logic, where
Right.
winners losers, it's a digital logic, there's ones and zeros. But then the other kind, another kind of like way of conceiving politics would be not through the distinguishing between friends and enemies, but through the concept of mediation, that, there is you and hospitality, right? And, you mediate your differences. You don't resolve your differences. And this is also kind of like the comic mode of we survive our differences. And, so there is an idea of politics as mediation. Now, I sort of want, like, the way I'm kind of what I'm
Yep.
sneakily doing is I'm getting to the very end of this chapter, which I find really wonderful. Like, they have arrived at Fort Yuma and they see like a whole bunch of things. Like, it's actually kind of like a anarchic kind of situation, right? They're the Yumas, they're camping there. That's their traditional territory. And then, but the Americans have already arrived, including Abraham Lincoln's cousin or whatever, Dr. Lincoln, right? He's running a ferry. So there are like all sorts of people in um, this place that they've arrived to, like Fort Yuma. And basically, like Glanton is already kind of thinking, well, how am I going to take all of this over? Right. And so he's like, well, first I'll make a fake deal with the Yumas, and we'll basically secure between my party and your party, we'll secure the entire ferry operation and we'll make boatloads of money. But then, of course, they're going to betray the Yumas, right? So, but at the end of chapter 17, they go into the Yuma camp,
Mm.
Glanton and his lieutenants. So I assume Brown and the judge or something like that. And they meet Caballo on Pelo, like the leader of the Yumas, and these guys are all dressed like all weirdly, right? Like wearing a belted wool overcoat. Beneath it was a woman's blouse of embroidered silk and a pair of pantaloons of gray cassonet. And everybody kind of looked a little bit, clownish, I guess. So
Mm.
Glanton just read them literally, and that's his, tragic flaw. That's his downfall, right? Brown spat on the ground in disgust, and Glanton shook his head, right? And
Mm.
again, uses the N word or whatever, like so conflating, lesser beings together, right? Like,
Right.
uh, you know, the Caballo Ompelo says, we read the last sentence of the chapter. The mogul tossed his chin, a small gesture darkened with a certain ambiguity. Buenas tardes, he said, de donde viene? Right? Like, where have you come from? Where are you from? I think that's like, to me, it's also like, it reminds me of the second epigraph where the Chinese scholar is talking about
Mm,
the West and Japanese Westernness, like always trying to like there's always revolution, there's always change, there's always chaos, there's always war. But the Chinese, like a scholar says in China, there's like stability and tradition and intergenerational unity, right?
mhm,
Um, and so, like, this is Valerie's way of sort of like opposing tradition and novelty and seeing what comes of the two. But, Valerie will say your intelligence is a beast, and, that demands like a fresh change every day. And so, when the Yumas say, where are you from? Like, we
mm.
should also realize that the Yumas are from there.
Yes.
They've
Thank you.
always been there, like,
Right.
so this is also a kind of a mediating move, right? Like, where are you from? You have arrived here. This is our place, right?
Right.
And we're not like
Right.
we're not kicking you out, or we don't necessarily think of you as an enemy, but how are we going to mediate our differences? And like, I don't know, I just feel like um, you know, we have the red color associated with China, but also with indigeneity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the evening redness in the West and the sort of thematics of redness here, like make me want to associate what the Chinese scholar says in Valerie's essay on the Yalu with what um, the Yumas are saying here. They're here to mediate differences, but all Glanton can see is like another sucker
Mhm.
uh, that they're going to prank and
Right.
basically exploit and destroy, right? So that the way the chapter ends is also really interesting.
Well, that's so cool because between you and I, we've brought those three quotes into this chapter. And it's kind of, we're feeling like the novel is starting to wind down, and yet we got to refer to those three quotes. I did
Yes,
not plan that. We didn't talk about it the other day. It's
I
just, it,
did not talk about this. Yeah,
no, in our production meeting, it's just kind of interesting that we both had thoughts about that, you know? And we probably will again even by the time we finish it. Yeah, that's quite a great ending. And I had misunderstood who said that, and you helped me realize it's really the people that live there who said, "Where are you from?" Which is quite interesting, when you're somewhere else and people ask you where you're from. It's a real thing. And this idea that it's their land, that the white people are coming in and taking it over, when it's a great example of there's people already living there.
and this, like, I mean, I don't know much about it. Maybe I can learn a little bit more in the next couple over the next couple episodes.
Hmm.
But this is
Hmm.
also like the beginning of the Yuma Wars,
Yes.
basically.
Yeah.
Like what happens here at the fort um, precipitates some long, sort of
Mm-hmm.
protracted kind of war.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of war, um, between I think the Yumas and maybe the Americans. I'm not sure. I'll have to figure
And
that out.
okay, and I also appreciate your thinking of this guy Schmidt. And there's nothing like jumping from the judge and wondering what his motives are to going to a Nazi who's not. It works for me. That tracks.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah,
Wow. I mean, I don't know. I think we've kind of covered it, have we? As much as
I think
possible.
so. Yeah, as much as
Yeah.
possible.
I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot and I
Me
really
too.
appreciate it. And you know what?
I do too.
I have read Benjamin, believe it or not, over the years. It's just been a long time because I used to be quite involved in reading The Will to Power and different books by Nietzsche. So it's kind of good to hear him being revisited in over these months of us talking and our strange podcast experience and experiment.
Yes.
Yes. Um, I want to
Gotta
put
listen.
that we started out talking about the tarot cards. Anyone listening, you can go to our Substack page, and it's free. You can find it just Googling Blood Meridian Now Substack, and you'll find it. And we're posting a few cards so you can see what they look like and some notes about the cards. They're not long. They take a minute to read and look at, so you can find out content there. And we have content on our Instagram page, Blood Meridian Now on Instagram. And so you can find all kinds of extra things on both of those pages, whichever social media you prefer.
And
JDH.
there's a great card, like it's I think it's the king of something, maybe. But there's a figure that comes out of William Blake's illuminated
Oh yeah. King of
book called
Wands.
the Book of Urizen. And you know, there's a figure seated who's writing with both hands. He's ambidextrous like the judge. And on the scroll that is sitting on his lap, it does say, "Before man was, war waited for him."
Hmm.
So yeah, we should talk more about Blake and McCarthy at some point.
Yeah. Okay,
Like
well we will. We
there's
will for sure.
we will in a few chapters for sure.
And also it's funny because Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright seems like the most association right there.
Yes,
His poem. Yeah, thank you. And that was a card that Stag made, and it's really cool.
I
Under the
like
guise
it.
of your guidance of William Blake. So see, you are involved. Um, I hope you have a great, wrapping up your school year,
You too, Candy.
and I hope our
When's the
listeners.
conference? In June?
In June, the end of June. So I have a little bit of time to do my science of magic and science of surprise. And coincidentally, with this chapter, it was funny that that was coming around at the same time. And I hope you just have a great rest of your week. And same to our listeners. Thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it.
We really do. Thanks, Candy. It was great talking with you. I'm sure we'll get back together to talk about chapter 18 before your conference.
Oh, we will. We will
It's
for
like
sure.
it's the smallest chapter in the novel, but it's also very interesting.
Very interesting. And there's a woman in it.
Yeah,
So at long last, we might talk about a female character.
she's like the anti-judge,
Yes.
or at least the real person based on this
Yeah.
character.
Yes, for sure. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and you too. Talk to you
Thanks.
later.
Bye.